Yabba dabba doo! Terry Caliendo, Dedicated Managers, back again. The OAuth 2.0 Authorization Framework, IETF 6749 is what we're discussing here. Very exciting stuff. I finished talking about all this stuff up to here, got through the access token in the last one, and now we're going to talk about the refresh token. And that's a pretty important part of keeping your access alive. So the refresh tokens are credentials used to obtain access tokens. So you get an access token to start, but that access token has a limited duration or limited life. And so to get a new one, you need a refresh token to go and get a new access token. We'll show that in the picture coming up. Refresh tokens are issued to the client by the authorization server and are used to obtain a new access token when the current access token becomes invalid or expires, which is what I just said. Or to obtain additional access tokens with identical or narrower scope. So if you wanted a narrower scope, I don't have enough experience to understand why you'd want to reduce your scope. I don't think because you wouldn't be passing it to somewhere else, but I'm just not exactly sure on that. Or fewer permissions. So you could do that. I don't know why you'd do that. Issuing a refresh token is optional at the discretion of the authorization server. So the authorization server does not have to give a refresh token if it is requested. Not sure exactly why you wouldn't want to do that, but I mean that is there. It's in the spec there that the authorization server can say, hey, no, I'll give you can just return the access token, but not return a refresh token. If the authorization server issues a refresh token, it is included when issuing an access token. So we'll get into that, but when do you get the refresh token? That comes when the initial access token is sent. A refresh token is a string representing the authorization granted to the client by the resource owner. So again, it's like the access token. It represents the authorization. It represents the authorization granted, and that string is usually opaque to the client. So the client doesn't need to know what's inside the refresh token. Only the authorization server needs to really understand what's in that refresh token. The token denotes an identifier and used to retrieve that authorization information. So this refresh token represents the fact that the user has given access to to a certain client. Unlike access tokens, refresh tokens are intended for use only with authorization servers and are never sent to the resource server. So the client is never going to send a refresh token to the resource server. So the refresh token would never get sent to Google Drive or Google Calendar or whatever the resource that I'm trying to work with. It's only sent to the authorization server. So now I'm going to go through the steps here and just kind of talk about this picture here. And what I've done is I've taken, so that I don't scroll down and back up, I've just taken this page down here, scrolled it up, and put it here. So you can see the flow illustrated in Figure 2 is in the following steps. That's this down here, and the stuff below it just moved to another tab so I can quickly switch between the two. So the way it starts out, the client requests an access token by authenticating with the authorization server and presenting an authorization grant. So that's this step right here, and this is the authorization code flow that we'll talk about later on. This is that code that the client gets back. It's just this abstract thing that says, yes, give this client the actual access token, and that's done for security reasons to keep this token from actually ever going through the browser and stuff like that. We'll talk about that when we get into I've kind of talked about it a little bit, and I'll talk about it again when I get into the actual flows, which are these things here. If I go back to the top, when I get into these sections here, section 4, the authorization code grant, the implicit, and these other twos that aren't really used too often. Well, this one is used with Twitter. So the client presents that grant, which is a code that presents it to the server, and then the server authenticates that code and says, yep, you did do this authorization stuff. And so it'll pass back the access token along with a refresh token. So that's where that refresh token first gets sent to the client. And the main thing to know here is that the authorization server authenticates the client. So this client has to be in a type of client that can be authenticated. So a Vue.js web application or a React front-end application can't hide a client secret, so it cannot get a refresh token. So if you're doing a front-end application and you want to get a refresh token, you can't get one because you have to be able to authenticate. And since front-end JavaScript clients can't hide anything from the browser or potential hackers because all the code is sent to the browser, typical average users wouldn't be able to find it, but a programmer would. So you can't hide a secret. So that's why refresh tokens are not allowed in the implicit code grant. So we'll talk about that here. This implicit grant does not allow for refresh tokens to be used. The client makes a protected resource request to the server by presenting the access token. The resource server validates the access token, and if valid, serves the request, and then repeats steps C and D. So basically, the client sends that code over. The authorization sends back the token and the refresh token. So the client saves those things. This is probably happening on a server somewhere. It's a PHP. If it was WordPress, it would be the back-end PHP code on the WordPress running on Apache on the server back there. So that information is stored. But when the client needs to go out and research and retrieve some information or write something to the resource server, if this is Google Drive, it sends that access token along, and then the resource server says, okay, yeah, that token is valid, and sends back the resource or allows the thing to be written or whatever it needs to do. It allows that to happen, and that cycle continues until that token is no longer valid, and finally the client is going to send that access token along. And remember, we said in the previous video that access token is opaque to the client. So the client doesn't really need to read that access token. So it still thinks the access token is valid after it might have expired. And so it sends along that access token. The resource server says, nope, sorry, I just checked that access token. It's not valid anymore. So it sends back an error saying, hey, sorry, access is no access allowed. Go and get a new access token. And so that's when the client takes that refresh token that it got up here and it sends it along back to the authorization server. See how we're talking to the authorization server up here, and now we're talking to it down here. The client sends that refresh token back to the authorization server. The authorization server then sends back an access token and optionally a new refresh token. We'll read about that in a second. And so now the client has a new access token that it can go back through this loop again until that token expires. So that's kind of all that stuff there. I talked about since since the access is invalid, the resource server returns the invalid token. That's stuff up here going back here. And then the client requests a new access token by authenticating with the authorization server again. So I didn't say that, but this refresh token, when it's sent, the client also has to authenticate and say, hey, I'm the client that you're expecting to pass a refresh token, this refresh token. So it's just, if that refresh token gets stolen by another third party, they can't use that refresh token to get another access token because they don't have the client secret. So, it's another security implementation. The client authentication requirements are based on the client type and the authorization server policies. That's just saying that's implementation. The authorization server authenticates the client and validates the refresh token, and if valid, issues a new access token and optionally a new refresh token. So that's kind of what I said here. The client, sends that refresh token over to the authorization server. The authorization server verifies the client because along with that refresh token becomes that client, authorization. That's outside the scope of this. It just know that the authorization server has to make sure that this client is who they say they are. Now, we're not talking about the resource owner here. we're not re-authenticating the resource owner, we're re-authenticating the client, the thing that is trying to use the refresh token to get a new access token to use on behalf of the resource owner. So just that kind of trips me up a little bit. Again, I get confused. I merge this client into the resource owner and the user agent and a whole bunch of other things, and it's not. It's this one simple thing. It's it's the application itself that's trying to do stuff on behalf of the user. So we'll get more into that, but again, basically this is the flow of getting this refresh token that is not used. The refresh token is not sent to the resource server. If this is, again, in my example, Google Drive, the client never sends a refresh token to Google Drive. It sends access tokens, and when that access token it keeps using over and over and over again, and when that access token finally is invalid, then it goes through this process where the error is returned from the resource server, and the client has to go and get a new access token. It does that by sending a refresh token back to the authorization server, and the authorization server sends the access token back. So in other words, the client doesn't have to re-authenticate the user. It's got that authentication in the refresh token. So this flow here that we'll talk about, this is the code grant. The resource owner, that's the person that owns whatever is trying to have done to it. The person who owns the space on Google Drive. The authorization server doesn't have to re-authenticate that resource owner in this instance here with a refresh token, because that's already taken care of. So when the client tries to get a new access token, it doesn't have to go back to the user and say, hey, resource owner, do you want to give permission? It's already given, because this is a secure place that the resource owner has given this client, because it can hold a secret, has given it this ability to keep this refresh token that stays for a long time and can continue to get new access tokens. So got a little bit wild there. That's again, it'll become more clear as I talk about the different parts when I get into this actual diagram here as far as the authorization code down in 4 and start talking about this stuff here. So hopefully that was clear in the beginning. I rambled there at the end, got a little off track, but the beginning I think was clear in that what these refresh tokens are used for and where they're sent. They are not sent to the individual resource servers like Google Drive or Google's Calendar or Gmail if you're integrating with Gmail, asking to send an email on its behalf. That's done with Google's authorization server back here. So this has been a Dedicated Managers Technology Consulting video. Hopefully you liked it. Again, this is some dry stuff, I'm realizing. I thought this was going to be super exciting to go through the RFC. I don't know what I was thinking. But anyway, I'm going to power through these videos and get to a stopping point and move on to some new stuff. So please do subscribe. We've got, it's youtube.com/dedicatedmanagers. Here's the videos, or the playlist here. These are the different playlists I've been working on. These are more popular this one, and this one are more popular. This one obviously is pretty dry, more of a resource that people might come across here and there. So it's more for me to force myself to use the terminology and really learn it. Because they say, if you want to learn something, teach it. So signing out, Terry Caliendo, Dedicated Manager. See you in the next video. Again, I do these kind of on the fly. If you notice any mistakes, or if sometimes I say one thing and I mean another, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. We'll see you in the next video. Take care. Have a great day. Happy programming, happy coding, happy life.